Welcome to List Lab. Today we're counting down 10 unsolved mysteries of Easter Island, one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth and home to the towering Moai that still raise serious questions about belief, power, and survival. Our central question is this: what really happened on Rapa Nui, from the first arrival across the Pacific to the creation, movement, meaning, and fall of its sacred stone giants? We explore mainstream archaeological evidence alongside alternative interpretations in a balanced and fair way. So if you enjoy Mystery Examined carefully, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Number 10. The First Voyage to a Lonely World. Every mystery on Easter Island begins with one staggering fact. Somebody found it. Rapa Nui lies so far out in the Pacific that even today, its isolation feels extreme, which makes the first successful landfall one of the greatest navigation mysteries in human history. Most researchers agree the first settlers were Polynesian voyagers, but the exact route they took, the islands they launched from, and even the date of settlement are still debated. Some older interpretations place settlement much earlier, even as far back as the 4th century AD, while more recent radiocarbon studies point to a later arrival during the great eastward surge of Polynesian expansion in the 13th century. If that later timeline is correct, then the achievement looks even more astonishing, because it means a tiny island was deliberately found in a vast ocean within a relatively short period of exploration. Polynesian wayfinding traditions use stars, swells, birds, winds, and subtle changes in the sea in ways many modern people still underestimate. So the real mystery is not whether ancient navigators were capable, because they clearly were, but how they planned such a precise voyage and whether they could repeat it. The language, traditions, and material culture of the island firmly link Rapa Nui to the wider Polynesian world, so its people did not emerge in isolation. Yet the opening chapter remains partly hidden beyond the horizon, where the exact homeland, the number of voyages, and the scale of early contact still refuse to come fully into view. Number 9. Did the islanders reach the Americas? If even part of this mystery is true, then the history of the Pacific may be far more connected than people once believed. One of the most provocative questions surrounding Easter Island is whether Polynesians, or people linked to them, reached the Americas before Europeans ever crossed the Atlantic in force. The idea matters because it challenges the long-standing image of the Pacific as a sealed world, cut off from the New World until much later. Writers outside the mainstream have pushed this argument for decades, and Thor Heyerdahl made it famous by suggesting American influence traveled westward across the Pacific. What makes the debate harder to dismiss now is that genetics has entered the picture. Large-scale studies have identified a Native American ancestry component in several eastern Polynesian populations, and newer work involving both ancient and modern Rapa Nui individuals suggests some form of contact may have happened centuries before Europeans arrived. That is a powerful clue, but it is not a complete answer. The ancestry could reflect Polynesians reaching the Americas and returning, Native Americans drifting west, or contact taking place elsewhere in eastern Polynesia before spreading further. Even the sweet potato, often treated as a smoking gun, remains open to debate because some researchers argue that natural drift might explain at least part of its journey. So the mystery has shifted. It is no longer simply whether contact happened, but who moved, where they met, and why the archaeological traces on land remain so sparse. Somewhere behind the genetics may lie one of the most remarkable voyages in world history, but the shoreline evidence is still frustratingly quiet. Number 8. What were the Moai built for? The Moai are so famous that it is easy to stop asking the most important question. Why were they built at all? These statues were not random monuments placed wherever there was space. They were raised on ahu platforms and set into the landscape in ways that made them central to community life ritual identity, and probably power itself. The mainstream interpretation sees them as sacred ancestors, powerful figures whose presence linked the living to the spiritual world and reinforced social order. But that may only be part of the answer. Other careful interpretations suggest the Moai also expressed lineage, territory, authority, and access to key resources, especially in a fragile environment where status and survival may have been tightly connected. Fringe theories sometimes leap far beyond the evidence and claim lost technologies or non-human involvement, yet archaeology has never produced support for those ideas. What it has shown is something more interesting. The Moai were not isolated sculptures admired from a distance. They were embedded in ritual memory, land use, and community structure over long stretches of time. Research on Ahu locations suggests many were tied closely to freshwater access, hinting that sacred meaning may have overlapped with the island's most practical concerns. Work at the quarry has also strengthened the idea that statue production may have carried associations with fertility and agricultural success. So perhaps the real mistake is trying to force the Moai into one category. On Rapa Nui, religion, ancestry, territory, and survival may all have been speaking through the same stone faces. Number 7. How were the Moai moved? This is the question that turned Easter Island from a historical mystery into a global obsession. Some Moai weigh many tons, yet hundreds were transported from the quarry to platforms across the island with no wheels, no metal machinery, and no obvious easy solution. For years, that challenge created space for speculation, because to outside observers, the feat looked almost impossible. Traditional explanations include dragging the statues on sledges or moving them over rollers, and some versions of those ideas may well be right for certain cases. But the most famous possibility is also the strangest: that the statues were made to walk. Oral tradition hinted at this long before modern researchers began treating it seriously, and that is part of what gives the theory its staying power. In practical experiments using replicas shaped like roadside moai, teams have shown that a statue can be rocked forward in a controlled side-to-side motion, with ropes, and moved surprisingly effectively. Researchers have also pointed to details such as the statue's forward lean, their base shape, and the form of the ancient roads as clues that upright movement may fit more of the evidence than once believed. Still, no single experiment settles the entire question. The largest statues present different challenges, and transport methods may have changed depending on terrain, size, and available resources. That is what keeps the mystery alive. The islanders clearly solved a problem that still feels daunting today, but the exact solution may never boil down to one simple trick. The deeper fascination is that the answer was probably cleverer, more flexible, and more human than the myths surrounding it. Number 6. The unfinished Moai of the Quarry. Few places on Earth feel as if time stopped halfway through a thought. At Rano Raraku, the main Moai quarry, statues lie half-carved in stone. Others stand embedded on the slopes, and the entire landscape looks like a vast project that was interrupted before anyone could explain why. It is one of the most haunting sights on Easter Island because it seems to capture a civilization in mid-action. The obvious theory is sudden collapse. Maybe warfare, famine, political chaos, or some other crisis brought the carving tradition crashing to a halt. That dramatic explanation has a strong emotional pull, but the archaeology paints a more complicated picture. The quarry was not just a place of extraction. It was also a productive, fertile landscape with water, enriched soils, and evidence of long-term cultivation. That matters because it suggests this was not a dead industrial zone, but a lived-in place tied to survival as well as symbolism. Even more intriguing, some statues standing in the quarry may never have been intended for transport at all. which means not every unfinished-looking moai was truly abandoned. Detailed mapping has also revealed multiple production zones, pointing to different groups working in parallel rather than one centralized operation. So the mystery is not simply why the work stopped, it is whether it stopped in the dramatic way people imagine, or whether beliefs, priorities, and social structures gradually shifted until carving no longer held the same urgency. The unfinished moai look like silence in stone, but they may record a slow change rather than a sudden ending. Number 5. The Great Toppling. At some point, the island turned against its own giants. Many moai that once stood upright on their ahu were later found toppled, broken, or lying face down. And that transformation remains one of the most dramatic and emotionally charged mysteries in Rapa Nui history. These were not ordinary objects, they were sacred, heavy, and symbolically loaded, so bringing them down would have meant something serious. One long-standing explanation links the destruction to inter-clan rivalry during a period often described as Huri Moai, when statues became targets because they embodied the power and legitimacy of rival groups. It is a compelling picture, but the evidence is not as straightforward as older accounts sometimes suggest. Some researchers argue that the case for widespread, organized, pre-contact warfare is thinner than popular retellings imply, and that some items once presented as weapons may have been practical obsidian tools used in many contexts. At the same time, it is impossible to ignore what happened after European contact. Disease, slaving raids, missionary pressure, and escalating disruption tore through the island's society in ways that would have destabilized both political authority and sacred traditions. Historical reports suggest statues were still standing when Europeans first recorded the island in 1722, which means the toppling was not simply an ancient act lost in deep prehistory. In some specific cases, natural forces such as earthquakes may also have played a part, though they do not explain the wider pattern alone. That leaves us with a darker and more complicated mystery. The fallen moai may not belong to one single moment of destruction, but to a long period in which old meanings were attacked, abandoned, or overwhelmed. However it happened, the toppling marked more than broken stone. It marked the visible collapse of a sacred order. Number 4. What lies beneath the statues. The familiar image of Easter Island is misleading in one very important way. What look like giant heads rising from the earth are often only the visible tops of much larger statues buried below the surface. That discovery reshaped public understanding of the moai because it revealed not only their true scale, but also how much of the story remains hidden underground. For some people, the buried bodies became fuel for conspiracy, with claims that they were intentionally concealed to hide sacred carvings or forgotten knowledge. The archaeological evidence points in a less dramatic but still fascinating direction. Over time, sediment, colluvium, and quarry debris built up around upright statues, gradually burying their lower sections without any single deliberate burial event. In other words, the island itself slowly swallowed parts of its own monuments. Yet excavation has revealed more than just torsos. Some statues carry carvings and petroglyphs that are invisible when only the heads are exposed, suggesting added layers of symbolism and later modification. That matters because it shows the moai were not always fixed or finished in the way modern viewers might assume. The buried sections also place the statues within a richer archaeological context, tied to quarry activity, cultivation, and long-term landscape change. This was not an empty ceremonial backdrop. It was a worked and inhabited environment where monument making and daily life overlapped. So the surprise is not only that the moai have bodies, it is that the most famous image of Easter Island is still only a partial view of what is really there. Number 3. Collapse before or after contact. This may be the most important Easter Island mystery of all. because it shapes the meaning of almost every other one. For years, Rapa Nui was presented as the ultimate warning from history, a society that destroyed itself through environmental ruin before outsiders ever arrived. It is a powerful story, but power and accuracy are not always the same thing. In one influential version, deforestation led to scarcity, violence, and pre-contact collapse, turning the island into a lesson about self-destruction. In another, the islanders adapted under pressure for centuries and suffered their greatest catastrophe only after European contact brought disease, slavery, and colonial disruption. The evidence does confirm major deforestation and ecological change, but researchers still argue over what drove it. Human activity clearly mattered, yet rats damaging palm regeneration may also have played a serious role in reshaping the landscape. What makes the mystery more complex is that archaeology also points to resilience. The islanders developed intensive agricultural strategies that suggest adaptation and persistence rather than immediate failure. Genetic studies have further challenged the old collapse narrative by finding no clear sign of the massive pre-contact population crash once widely assumed. By contrast, the historical record of the 19th century leaves no doubt that contact-era shocks devastated the island's people, leadership, and continuity. So the real question is no longer just whether collapse happened, it is when, how, and how much of the old story was shaped by outsiders looking for a cautionary tale. Easter Island may still warn us about environmental fragility, but it may also warn us about the danger of telling oversimplified histories. Number 2. Why invest so much in monument building? Even if we solve the engineering, another mystery remains underneath it all. Why would a small island society devote so much energy to carving and raising giant monuments in the first place? To modern eyes, it can look like a contradiction. In a resource-limited environment, such labor appears extravagant, even reckless, but that assumption may miss how monument building actually worked within the society that created it. The Moai may not have been a distraction from survival. They may have been part of the system that made survival possible. Some theories emphasize elite control, with leaders directing labor through religion, prestige, and obligation. Others focus more on competition between king groups, each expressing identity and authority through increasingly ambitious monuments. Recent mapping of the Quarry supports the idea that multiple groups may have been producing statues in parallel rather than under one rigid central command, which makes the process feel more distributed and socially embedded. Research on Oahu locations also suggests monument building was closely tied to predictable resources such as fresh water, hinting that sacred architecture and practical control may have reinforced one another. Even more intriguingly, work at the Quarry suggests statue production may have helped create fertile soils that supported cultivation, linking monument work to food systems rather than setting them apart. That possibility changes the tone of the entire mystery. Instead of asking why the islanders built statues instead of solving real problems, we may need to ask whether the statues were one of the ways they organized society, resources, and meaning under difficult conditions. If so, the Moai were not excess. They were infrastructure in sacred form. Number 1. The worldview behind the Moai. The deepest mystery of Easter Island may be the one we are least equipped to solve. We can measure the roads, study the quarry, reconstruct transport methods, and debate population history, but none of that fully tells us what it felt like to live in a world where the Moai mattered. The mainstream interpretation sees them as ancestors filled with mana, protecting communities and legitimizing leaders through sacred presence. That alone is powerful, but it may still be too narrow. Other interpretations suggest the statues formed part of a wider worldview linking land, water, agriculture, ancestry, and authority into one connected system. The island's undeciphered rongorongo script intensifies the mystery, because it raises the possibility that crucial elements of Rapa Nui thought were once recorded but are now closed to us. And if major cultural continuity was shattered in the 19th century by disease, enslavement, and social upheaval, then some meanings may have been lost before they could ever be properly preserved. The statues themselves were not inert objects. Some once had inlaid eyes, which may have transformed them from carved stone into beings experienced as spiritually active in ritual life. Later traditions centered on the Birdman cult, Orongo, and Makemake also suggest that Rapa Nui belief changed over time rather than remaining fixed around one unchanging sacred system. That makes the Moai even more fascinating because they belong to a society whose spiritual life evolved, adapted, and endured before later trauma broke the chain of understanding. In the end, the greatest mystery is not simply how the statues were made, moved, or broken. It is the inner world that made them necessary, and how much of that world disappeared before anyone could fully record it. Easter Island proves that even when we map the quarry, measure the roads, and study the statues in detail, the biggest mysteries can still survive. Which entry did you find most interesting, and which explanation feels strongest to you? If you enjoyed this investigation into the mysteries of Rapa Nui, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.